The desert sun over the Chihuahuan Ridge did not merely shine. It functioned like a physical weight, pressing a blinding, white hot heat into the cracked dirt and compounding the rhythmic jackhammer thumping inside Scott's skull. As senior corporate auditors for a top 3 accounting firm, the four men spent their lives evaluating structural risk, identifying hidden liabilities, and reconciling complex ledgers where every single decimal point carried massive financial consequences. But the previous evening's bachelor party for Don Jose had been a masterclass in a catastrophic personal asset mismanagement. A relentless progression of top shelf mezcal, vintage tequila, and a total absence of sleep had left them physically and mentally bankrupt. Their bodies were vibrating with a fragile, hypersensitive residue of extreme overindulgence. Yet, as they stood at the dusty trailhead overlooking the jagged mouth of the canyon, there was absolutely no hesitation, no talk of postponement, and no desire to back out. They were elite corporate climbers, men who prided themselves on executing a plan to the letter regardless of adverse conditions, and they were entirely unanimously committed to every single step of the itinerary they had spent months scheduling. Don Jose adjusted his heavy nylon climbing harness with sharp, deliberate movements, though his fingers trembled noticeably against the metal buckles as he pulled the webbing tight across his waist. He was the groom, a brilliant tax strategist whose normally immaculate, boardroom-ready posture was replaced today by a stubborn, hung-over slouch that he fiercely tried to mask with an authoritative demeanor. He looked at the vast desert expanse, his eyes bloodshot and watering against the glare, and declared they were already losing daylight and would not jeopardize their window of entry for something as trivial as a collective headache. We lose daylight, we lose our window, Don Jose muttered, spitting into the dust. I didn't fly out to New Mexico to sit in a hotel room because we can't handle a few shots of mezcal. We are dropping into that hole. J.R., the firm's sharpest forensic accountant, leaned heavily against the rear bumper of their rented SUV, his face a pale shade of gray. But he offered a ragged grin and snapped his harness buckles shut to prove his resolve. Damn right, J.R. grasped, his voice dry and rough. I am not missing the famous underground Bat Cathedral for a little headache. If I can survive a 3-day IRS audit with a fever, I can survive a walk in a cave. Let's move. Trey, a towering senior partner whose physical presence was imposing as his professional reputation, hoisted his massive technical backpack onto his shoulders with a grunt, refusing to let his own nausea slow the group down. Trey pointed up at the cloudless, piercing blue sky, arguing that the weather report was utterly flawless, which meant the primary environmental risk of flash flooding was effectively zero, and the corporate risk assessment for the excursion remained entirely green. Look at the sky, boys, Trey said, his deep voice cutting through the dry air. Zero cloud cover. The risk assessment for a flash flood is completely green. The data says we go, so we go. Scott, the youngest partner in the firm and a lifelong traditional climber who had designed the route in the unmapped depths of Cueva del Rincon, checked the primary anchors around 2 massive limestone boulders at the edge of the pit. The underground stream is roughly 80 feet straight down, Scott said, adjusting his helmet lamp and offering a confident nod. It's a simple, straightforward rappel. Once we clear the vertical drop, the air cools right down, the sun stops punishing our eyes, and we follow the water right out to the canyon floor. We'll be back at the resort for steaks by 7. They were a unified front, bound by a culture of absolute compliance and a shared refusal to show weakness, entirely unaware that their compromised cognitive abilities and severely dehydrated bodies were already tipping the scales of survival against them. It was a unanimous decision born of pride and compromised judgment, a collective agreement to push past their physical limits that served as the first and most foundational bad choice of the day. Scott volunteered to take the lead, stepping backward over the precipice and letting the heavy climbing rope slide smoothly through his mechanical belay device as he dropped into the black mouth of the cavern. The transition from the upper world to the lower was instantaneous and jarring, the blinding desert heat vanishing in a single breath, replaced by thick, heavy humidity that smelt faintly of copper and concentrated ammonia. Below him, the dark water of the ancient subterranean stream rushed through the limestone floor with a low, rhythmic roar that echoed off the unseen walls like distant machinery. He reached the bottom, unclipped his carabiners from the rope, and clicked on his high-powered LED headlamp. The bright white beam slicing through the absolute darkness to reveal an immense, cavernous cathedral of rock. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted up the vertical shaft, his voice bouncing wildly off the stone as he gave the all clear for the remaining three to follow him into the dark. All clear, Scott's voice boomed up the chimney. Rope is free, drop down. One by one, the hungover crew rappelled down the narrow limestone chimney, their boots scraping against the damp rock as they descended into the humid belly of the mountain. The intense physical exertion of the rappel, combined with their severely dehydrated states, forced them to breathe heavily, their chests heaving as they touched down on the cavern floor and unbuckled their gear. They stood in a tight circle, their headlamps sweeping across the massive chamber, the sheer scale of the underground world momentarily distracting them from the throbbing pain behind their temples. Don Jose looked up, his headlamp illuminating the ceiling 80 feet above, where tens of thousands of tiny, dark-shaped shifted and writhed in a restless, living carpet of velvet. The sound of the immense colony of bats was a deafening, continuous wave of high-pitched clicks and chattering, a vibrating wall of noise that seemed to reverberate within the very bones of their skulls. "Look at this place," Don Jose whispered, his voice full of awe. "It's incredible. The photos didn't do it justice." Trey took a step forward, wiping a thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, his heavy technical boots sinking deep into a soft, spongy black material that blanketed the entirety of the cavern floor. "Unbelievable," Trey admitted, taking a heavy breath. "But man, what is that smell? It hits you right in the back of the throat." Because they were profoundly hung over and gasping for air from the physical strain of the drop, every single one of them was drawing deep, ragged breaths through their mouths, inhaling the stagnant air of the chamber. Locked into their mission and their entirely focused on maintaining their gung-ho pace, no one stopped to analyze the nature of the ground beneath their feet or the thick haze hanging in the air. The spongy floor was not mud or decaying earth. It was centuries of fresh, moist bat guano, accumulated in massive, undisturbed drifts along the subterranean waterway. As their heavy boots churned up the ancient damp droppings, they released an invisible, highly concentrated cloud of histoplasma fungal spores and toxic ammonia gas directly into the airspace. Deprived of sleep, severely dehydrated, and suffering from the systemic strain of their weekend of partying, their immune systems offered absolutely zero resistance to the airborne pathogen. JR stopped walking for a moment, leaning his shoulder against a wet limestone boulder as a deep hacking cough shattered the rhythm of their march. "Man, my chest," JR wheezed, his face turning slick and pale under his headlamp. "It feels tight, like someone is standing on my ribs." Scott turned back, shaking his head dismissively as he waved his hand through the damp air. "It's just a humidity change, JR," Scott said, pushing forward. "The air is super thick down here compared to the desert. Let's get closer to the running water. It'll be cooler and easier to breathe." They nodded in agreement, clapping JR on the shoulder. "Keep moving, partner. The faster we walk, the faster we get out of the canyon exit." They pushed onward, entirely oblivious to the reality that their lungs were already filling with fluid as the toxic dust triggered acute respiratory distress. By the time the four accountants reached the edge of the rushing underground creek, the physical toll of their environment had evolved from more discomfort into an agonizing internal fire. Don Jose dropped to his knees at the water's edge, his core body temperature skyrocketing as the acute fungal infection began to ravage his respiratory system, causing him to vomit violently into the cold stream. Trey stepped forward, grabbing the groom by his shoulders to stabilize him. "Jose, hey, talk to me, man. You okay?" Don Jose shook his head stubbornly, pulling away and wiping his mouth with a trembling hand. "I'm fine," Jose wheezed. His voice sounded hollow and strained. "Just a delayed reaction to last night. Keep moving. We stick to the schedule." JR sat down heavily on a low rock ledge a few feet away, his face slick with cold sweat and his vision blurring significantly as he struggled to draw a single, satisfying lungful of air. He did not ask to turn back, nor did he suggest aborting the trip. His pride remained intact, even as his breathing turned into a high-pitched, desperate whistle. "Just give me a second," JR rasped, clutching his chest. "I just need to catch my wind. My heart is racing." Trey knelt beside JR, pressing two fingers against the man's wrist and feeling the frantic, erratic pulse racing beneath the skin, his own anxiety spiking. "His pulse is off the chart, Scott," Trey called out. his voice echoing sharply over the sound of the rushing stream. Get the medical kit out of your pack. Let's see if we have some hydration packets or an oxygen bottle. Scott scrambled over the slick rocks, his coordination severely degraded by the lack of oxygen and the spreading toxicity in his own lungs. His hands shaking violently as he dragged his heavy canvas pack across the rough limestone edge. I'm on it, Scott yelled back, his breath coming into shallow gasps. Just hold on. In his haste and blurred focus, Scott dragged the abrasive material of the pack directly over a deep, dry crevice in the stone that had remained undisturbed for years. The sudden, violent vibration and the radiated heat from his hands instantly alarmed a massive hidden nest of bark scorpions resting within the shadows of the rock face. From the dark fissure, an angry, undulating swarm of the highly venomous arachnids poured out across the ledge, their pale yellow bodies moving with terrifying speed over the stone toward the source of the disturbance. Watch out, scorpions! Trey roared, lunging backward, but it was already too late. JR, firmly planted against the rock face to maintain his balance, let out a piercing scream of pure, unadulterated agony as 3 distinct stings pierced the thin, sweat-soaked fabric of his shirt along his spine. The neurotoxin struck his already heavily compromised cardiovascular system instantly, causing his body to convulse violently. JR, stay with me, Don Jose cried out, dragging himself across the gravel floor, coughing up flecks of blood as his own lungs failed. Scott, where's the EpiPen? Find the kit. Scott was frantically dumping the contents of his pack into the rocks, his eyes wide with horror as the truth hit him. Oh, God. Oh, no, Scott stammered, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. The medical bag. It's not here. We left it in the trunk of the rental car when we were loading the ropes. Trey stared at him, his face twisting in fury and disbelief. Are you kidding me? You forgot the kit? But there was no time for an argument. Within 10 minutes of the stings, JR's throat constricted completely. His heart gave out, and the brilliant forensic accountant lay dead on the wet stones of the cave floor. The sudden brutal reality of death slammed into the remaining 3 men like a physical blow, fracturing their corporate confidence and replacing it with a raw, disorganized terror. Yet even in the grip of panic, their deep-seated pack mentality remained intact. They would not abandon the mission to escape, but their path toward that escape was now distracted by pure survival instincts. We can't go back up to the rope, Scott stammered, his hands flying to his head as he stared at the pitch-black vertical shaft they had left behind. We don't have the strength to climb 80 feet of vertical rock in this state. Our lungs are burning. Trey grabbed Scott by his collar, forcing him to make eye contact. Then what is the play, Scott? Give me an audit of this route right now. Scott pointed down the narrow, tapering tunnel through which the underground stream disappeared, his voice cracking. The map. The topographical map showed an overflow tunnel that exits in the canyon floor half a mile down. It's entirely downhill, Trey. The water guides us straight out. It's our fastest mathematical probability of survival. Don Jose, barely standing as his lips turned a dangerous shade of blue, leaned against Trey for support. We go together, Jose wheezed, his eyes glassy. No one stays behind. Let's move. They abandoned JR's body on the ledge, a grim choice forced upon them by their failing muscles, and fled down the narrow tunnel, their headlamps splashing erratically against the low, jagged ceiling. The air grew tighter, hotter, and heavier with every yard they covered, the walls closing in until the tunnel transformed into a tight, oppressive corridor that forced them into a low crouch. Don Jose was rapidly losing his balance, his boots slipping on the algae-covered rocks as he stumbled repeatedly into the freezing, fast-moving water of the creek. Jose, hold on to my pack, Trey shouted over the roar of the water, but the groom's knees buckled completely, and he collapsed sideways into the shallow current. Trey and Scott dropped into the water beside him, lifting his head out of the stream. Jose, stay awake. Look at me, Scott yelled, slapping his cheek. But the toxic guano dust had successfully induced acute pulmonary edema within his chest. Jose was drowning in his own accumulating bodily fluids. Trey. Scott, keep going, Jose whispered, his eyes rolling back. Tell Vanessa I'm sorry. With a final agonizing gasp, the groom passed away in the dark, bringing a horrific permanent end to his bachelor party in a cold, forgotten corridor of the mountain. Driven now by nothing but the primal animalistic urge to stay alive, Trey and Scott crawled away from Jose's body, their movements frantic and uncoordinated as they pushed deeper in the narrow tunnel. They dragged themselves flat on their stomachs, their chests scraping against the rocky bottom of the stream as the ceiling dipped drastically, leaving only a few inches of airspace above the rushing, freezing water. Suddenly, a deep, terrifying groan echoed through the core of the mountain, a low-frequency vibration that shattered the limestone ceiling directly behind them. A massive, multi-ton slab of solid rock crashed down into the stream bed with a deafening roar, completely sealing the path back to Jose and the main vertical shaft. The horror of the cave-in was immediately compounded by a muffled scream of agony from Trey as the shifting perimeter of the fallen rock slab pinned his left leg firmly against the solid stone floor of the crawl space. They were completely trapped, entombed in a natural stone coffin no larger than a maintenance crawl space, with freezing water rushing past their torsos and the air remaining a stagnant, toxic soup of ammonia and fungal spores. Trey's legendary stoicism vanished in an instant, the calculated mind of the senior corporate partner entirely obliterated by the claustrophobic terror of his confinement. "Scott, my leg! I'm stuck!" Trey shrieked, his voice bouncing off the stone walls like a siren. "We're going to die in here! Scott, do something! Do something, Scott!" His own mind, fracturing under the weight of the claustrophobia, clawed frantically at the massive boulder pinning Trey's leg, his fingers bleeding. "Shut up, Trey! Shut up and let me think!" Scott yelled back, his breath coming in desperate gasps. "I'm trying to move it, but it won't budge." Trey began to thrash violently in the cramped space, kicking his free leg wildly as splashing freezing muddy water directly into Scott's eyes and mouth. "It's over! We're dead! Jose is dead! JR's dead! And we're next!" Trey screamed, his voice reaching a hysterical, piercing pitch that filled the tiny enclosed space. "Get me out! You did this! It was your map! You killed us, Scott! You killed us!" Scott tried to push Trey's flailing arms back, his own heart pounding against his ribs. "Trey, stop moving. You're going to trigger another cave-in. Listen to me. Stop thrashing." But Trey wouldn't stop. He was hyperventilating, screaming accusations, his flailing arms knocking Scott's headlamp sideways into the water, plunging them into near total darkness. "I can't breathe. You did this to us, you murderer." Trey shrieked into the blackness. The sound of Trey's story echoed inside the tiny chamber with deafening volume, pushing Scott past his absolute psychological breaking point. In the near total darkness, his mind stripped of all human reason, Scott reached blindly into his gear pack and wrapped his raw, bleeding fingers around the handle of his heavy steel rock hammer. "Trey, be quiet," Scott screamed, lunging forward in the tight, wet space. He swung the heavy metal tool with full, panicked force through the pitch blackness, and the steel hammer connected solidly with the side of Trey's skull, instantly silencing the screams. Scott froze in the absolute silence that followed the blow, his chest heaving as he gasped for the toxic air, the sudden absence of Trey's voice feeling heavier than any noise the man had made. He reached out with trembling raw fingers through the dark water, his hand brushing against Trey's neck, searching desperately for any sign of life. But there was no pulse. The senior partner was completely dead. "Trey," Scott whispered into the dark, his voice shaking. "Trey, come on, wake up. Please be quiet. Just wake up." But there was no response. The initial surge of relief at the silence was instantly replaced by a cold, paralyzing wave of pure horror as Scott realized the structural consequences of his desperate action. When Trey's body went entirely limp, his massive, muscular frame had shifted sideways with the flow of the current, jamming tightly into the narrowest choke point of the remaining escape tunnel ahead. Because Trey's left leg remained firmly anchored beneath the fallen limestone slab, his head weight now functioned as a solid human plug, completely sealing the only viable exit out of the mountain. By silencing his friend's panic, Scott had inadvertently and completely signed his own death warrant, trapping himself in a pitch-black tomb wedged between the rockfall behind him and the body of the man he had just killed in front of him. The hours began to bleed into one another without distinction, a long, agonizing continuum of darkness, where the only markers of time were the burning pain in his lungs and the slow, steady rise of the water level. The histoplasma spores he had inhaled hours earlier continued their destructive work, filling his alveoli with fluid and making every single breath feel like he was inhaling liquid fire. The freezing subterranean stream, blocked by the obstruction of Trey's body, began to pool within the small chamber, slowly creeping up to his chest, then his neck, until it was touching the underside of his chin. He knew with absolute clarity that he had to get out immediately or he would drown in the dark, a realization that sparked a final, frantic surge of survival adrenaline within his ruined body. In a state of advanced toxic delirium, weeping hysterically and whispering broken, repetitive apologies into the blackness, Scott reached back into his wet pack to retrieve his rock hammer and a sharp, chiseled steel python tool. To have any hope of squeezing his body through the narrow bottleneck of the remaining tunnel, he had to manually and systematically clear the human obstruction that blocked his path. With no light to see by, his headlamp lost in the water during the struggle, Scott began the brutal, unthinkable task of hacking his way through the choke point in the absolute dark. Every single strike of the steel hammer against the stone and the python sent dull, hollow vibrations through the floor of the cave, a rhythmic nightmare cadence that echoed his descent into madness. It took hours of agonizing muscular failure and nightmarish physical labor to clear enough space to move forward from the bottleneck. When he finally managed to tear and squeeze his battered frame through the bloody, narrow gap, the skin had been entirely stripped from his fingers and his mind was completely destroyed. He dragged his ruined body another 100 yards down the winding tunnel until he saw a magnificent, blinding glint of gray daylight at the canyon exit, where he collapsed onto a high stone ledge, unable to move another single inch. 48 hours after the four accountants had first descended into the mouth of the Cueva del Rincon, a local mountain search and rescue team spotted a flash of bright technical clothing near the base of the canyon floor. Chief Rescue Coordinator Marcus Vance led the scramble down the steep, rocky terrain, his team throwing open their medical packs as they reached the motionless form slumped on the limestone ledge. They found Scott in a state that was barely recognizable as human. His face was hollow and gaunt, his eyes bloodshot and staring blankly at the desert sky, and his hands were covered in deep, infection-riddled lacerations. His breathing was shallow and erratic, producing a horrifying, wet rattle that sounded like tearing paper with every rise and fall of his chest. They quickly secured him to a spine board, rushed his failing body up the canyon wall to the waiting ambulance, and hooked him up to a high-flow medical oxygen mask in a desperate bid to stabilize his vitals. As the ambulance sirens began to wail, the vehicle tearing down the bumpy, unpaved desert highway toward the nearest regional hospital, Scott's heart rate began to spike wildly on the emergency monitor. The paramedic leaned over him, checking his pulmonary response and urging him to hang on, telling him that he was finally out of the cave, that he was safe, and that medical help was only minutes away. Scott's cracked lips moved slightly beneath the plastic oxygen mask, but no audible sound emerged from his throat. His mind was locked into the darkness of the bottleneck, repeating the rhythmic strike of the hammer. The staggering volume of fungal spores he had inhaled, combined with extreme dehydration, profound blood loss, and the severe psychological shock of his escape, had initiated an irreversible cascade of multi-organ failure. Before the ambulance could even reach the paved highway at the city limits, Scott's blood pressure plummeted to zero, and the heart monitor let out a single, continuous flatline tone. The paramedic immediately initiated CPR, pumping rhythmically on the accountant's chest, but it was a mathematical certainty that the debt of their bad choices had been calculated. The ledger balance, and the final member of the bachelor party was pronounced dead before arrival.